commercial leases, we're going to actually just look at the documents. So what I'm going to talk about is you're still entitled to deferrals and waivers. It is proportionate to the loss of income. So for instance, if you have lost 60% of income, you only have to pay the remaining 40% of your rent. That's all you have to pay right now. The balance of the 60%, half of it has to be waived and half of it has to be deferred for a 2-year period minimum, for over a 2-year period. So you're going to pay it back over the 2-year period. Now, a lot of people are not doing this right, and that's why I thought I'm going to talk about it now. So I'm going to go and cross over to the documents, but hopefully that will help you. So send me an email, training@faqbusiness.com.au, and I will send that out to you. So basically what happened was, two things happened. First of all, what happened is we had National Cabinet Mandatory Code of Conduct. That was put into place. So it's a nationwide thing. Then basically what happened is each state had the territory had the opportunity to put in their own sort of overlay onto it, which they did. So the National Cabinet put in a code of conduct. And it was basically a code of conduct that said, this is about good faith leasing principles. So we want to make sure that businesses that have retail and commercial and retail, office and industrial premises can still keep going. And I know if you know so much that you are really struggling. It's really hurting. You're really hurting, right? Because, and I know one poor lady, she had been going, growing her business steadily, did all the right things. And then at the end of last year, she got a premises in the city, all ready to go for the first term. And then voila, COVID hit and completely screwed her. Now, that is horrible. And it's just awful. And the thing is, it's no fault of hers. It's no fault of the landlords. But there are things that you've got to take into account here. So although people like the banks are hurting, they've got a bit more capacity to hurt than a little business, okay? A little business that can't pay its rent is going to go bust. That's really the end of the story, right? A bigger business like a bank, if it doesn't get money in for the next few months for stuff, it's still earning interest income. It will still slap you with that. So all it's missing out is having access to those funds for the period of time until you start paying it again. So if things are waived. So what's happened is they've sort of said, right, as long as you pass on, if we defer your mortgage payments as the commercial landlord, if we defer your mortgage payments, you need to pass that on to your tenant. That was kind of the deal. Now, what's been happening is there's definitely been situations where the landlord has got that deferral, but they're not passing it on to their tenant, okay? And it's been very one-sided. So basically what happened was, it was the whole purpose of this code was to minimize the financial stress and to move the stress to places where it could be tolerated. So it's saying if you still earned 30% of your money, then you still pay the landlord 30% of the money straight away. Okay, so the landlord still had money coming in. But for the remaining 70%, part of that would get waived completely and part of it would get deferred. But the intention was that you go to your bank and saying, my tenant can't pay me, so can you please put a hold on my mortgage payments? So though the banks have been completely nasty with regards to new lending, they really haven't been giving it out particularly nicely as the government had intended. What has happened is that they are still giving it out, are giving the repayment holidays and things. So there are still a number of people on repayment holidays. That's important to note. So the code was enacted through the relevant states, and I'm going to show you the New South Wales one in a second. But basically what was happened is that it's intended that landlords will agree tailored, bespoke, and appropriate temporary arrangements for their clients. Okay, so for clients that were affected, that you'll come into some agreement with them. There should be a common interest in working together. You should discuss relevant issues and negotiate appropriate temporary leasing arrangements. Now, this is where some places have been really good. Like I've got a client in Castle Towers, and honestly, as far as I can see, Castle Towers have been really good. They have negotiated much, much, much lower rents for people. They have completely waived the need to be open during centre hours and all that stuff. They have been really, really good to their tenants, which is, unlike a lot of those big shopping malls, but they've been really good. However, just today on the news tonight, I only caught a little bit of it, but Westfield and Mosaic Brands, which is Strand Bags and Millers and all that stuff, are in a bit of some sort of war or something. And basically all the Strand Bags and Millers and Katie's and all that stuff are all shut down in Westfield because they're having a fight. So, when people are just not talking to each other. I've got clients where their landlord's just not talking to them. I have a fitness place. I have a place that sells supplements and stuff, and their landlord just won't talk to them. This is against the law, okay? So this code is designed for people that are affected by JobKeeper. Even if you're not affected by JobKeeper, certain acts of parliament still apply, and one of them is the Retail Leases Act in New South Wales. So that still applies. That still requires landlords to negotiate with you. They can't just say, tough freaking luck, pay your bills. That's not the way it works. They're meant to chat to you. They're meant to talk to you. So the first thing I'd like to point out is if they're not talking to you, get them to bloody start talking because they need to, okay? It's just not fair. It's not good enough. Okay, so what they should be doing is discussing arrangements with you. They should be open, honest, and transparent. They need to consider the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the tenant with specific regards to the revenue, the expenses, and the profitability. Based on the impact of COVID-19 and a reasonable period thereafter. Okay, so what that means is we had lockdown. So some people thought lockdown, yep, 100% drop in income, rent waived 100%, and that was done, and that was it. And then they've just gone back to paying normal rent. I'm like, no, you're still down. You're still eligible. You're still affected by COVID. You are still eligible to continue to get a rental reduction, a waiver, and a deferral. So make sure that you are, knowing what you're entitled to. So again, if you want these documents so that you can actually see them in that, then just let me know and I will send them out to you. So landlords cannot terminate leases due to non-payment. Tenants must remain committed to the terms of their lease though. So for instance, if you punch out a wall or something, you are still liable for fixing that, okay? It is not a cover-all thing where you're suddenly covered for nothing. No, you've still got to uphold your end of the bargain. Landlords must offer proportionate rent reductions in the form of waivers and deferral, okay? And again, there's an example of this to help explain because I know some people got really confused about how this worked and what it meant. But the waiver part of this has got to be at least 50% of the reduction in rent. And I'll go over that in a second with an example down the bottom. The payment of the rental deferral by the tenant must be amortized over the balance of the lease term and for a period of no less than 24 months, whichever is the greater. Which means if your lease ends within the next 2 years, they have to actually defer it for 24 months. So you're going to pay back in pieces for the next 24 months, even though you may not be a tenant of theirs anymore. If there was a reduction in statutory charges, land tax, council rates and that, they had to be passed on to the tenant. And I know some of you have been asked to pay full outgoings, which is just rubbish. You do not have to pay full outgoings. So again, make sure you know what you're entitled to. They could waive recovery of any other expense or outgoing payable by a tenant under lease terms during the period the tenant is not able to trade. Now note that one does talk about able to trade, so that's other outgoings, but the piece up here about land tax and council rate, that is a longer period of time. Repayments of the deferred amount should not commence until the earlier of the COVID-19 pandemic ending as defined by the Australian government. Clearly, we're nowhere near it ending, and or the existing lease expiring, okay? So once your lease expires, you have to start paying the money back to that landlord, okay? But over that 2-year period. If, however, you're still in there, then you don't actually have to start paying yet because you're still affected by COVID, okay? So this is really important to understand because one of my clients has already paid off their deferred rent already. but she's actually been doing well recently. So she was kind of happy about that. And I'm happy about that for her. No fees, interest, or charges should be applied with respect to rent waived. So they can't pass on anything to you for it. They can't draw on your security for the non-payment of rent. So they can't draw on a bond or a personal guarantee during the COVID pandemic period. You should also be given the opportunity to extend your lease for a period equivalent to the rent waiver and or deferral period outlined in item 2 above, which you can have a look at later. And very importantly, landlords agree to a freeze on rent increases. Now, if your turnover goes up and you had a turnover clause, that's a different story. The turnover clause still kicks in. So if you've reached a certain turnover or certain whatever, that still kicks in. But the rest of it, no, doesn't apply anymore. So landlords must freeze rent for the duration of COVID-19 pandemic and a reasonable subsequent recovery period. Again, we're nowhere near that. So you should not be getting a rent increase from your landlord. If you can't get anything happening, then you have to go to a binding mediation. This is where there's a bit of a potential issue. I had a client that went to the Small Business Commissioner of New South Wales very early on in the piece, the day after, in fact, we'd had a session about this particular topic. And she went to them and they basically said, after 4 weeks of saying nothing, you have to go talk to the landlord. The landlord wasn't talking to them. That was why they went to mediation in the first place. Very frustrating. But anyway, just to let you know that there is, this process, but they can't kick you out or do anything like that until they've gone through a mediation process. So there's certain requirements. I imagine what happened with this particular example is that they basically said there are other fish to fry. We'll deal with them first. Okay, so SME tenants which are eligible for the federal government's JobKeeper payment are automatically considered to be in financial distress under the code. So basically you had to be getting JobKeeper to pretty much be eligible to be covered. Otherwise, like I said, there are other laws that apply anyway, which is the Retail Leases Act in New South Wales. I think that was it. And the commencement expiry date, it started on the 3rd of April. So I know some of you were affected in March. Sorry, March wasn't actually covered. So they are within their rights, the landlord, to still charge you for March, unfortunately. Okay, so again, though, it should be negotiated. So if you can try and get some payment back from March or whatever, go for your life, particularly if you were quite heavily affected. Like I know some people in the beauty sector, for instance, were, or the gyms. So that's that part of it. So what that then became was it converted into the Retail and Other Commercial Leases COVID-19 Regulation 2020 in New South Wales, okay? This is the way we enacted it here. So the object of the regulation is to give effect to the mandatory code. That's why I went through the mandatory code in detail, because this doesn't actually change it. This is just saying we are using the mandatory code. It applies. So it prohibits and regulates the exercise of certain rights of lessors in regards to enforcement of certain requirements under the pandemic period. And it requires that the lessors and lessees renegotiate rent in good faith. Okay, so that's based on the code of conduct. Okay, so it says that the National Code of Conduct is that thing I just read out to you before. Prescribed period means the period ending at the day that is 6 months after on the day which your regulation commences. So this is where it gets a bit confusing, because the other thing kind of talks about the future, whereas this says that it's 6 months from the date the regulation applied. And the regulation applied from, does it have the date in there? 24th of April or so. So it's 6 months from the 24th of April. So technically the New South Wales one is only applying till October. That's where it's going to get a bit messy, and they're probably, I presume, going to have to extend this somehow. So we'll wait and see what happens. So a lessee is an impacted lessee if they qualified for JobKeeper and certain other rules, blah, 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 but basically they qualified for JobKeeper, okay? Prohibitions and restrictions relating to commercial leases. There was things about failure to pay rent and stuff, but there was also, as I mentioned when I talked about the Castle Towers example, they couldn't penalize you for not being open during the business hours, okay? Because they basically have to leave that as well, apart from just the rent. So if during the prescribed period a lessee under a commercial lease is an impacted lessee, the rent payable under the commercial lease must not be increased. unless it's the turnover thing I mentioned before. Okay, so there's that issue. If the impacted lessee is required by a provision of the commercial lease to pay a fixed amount that represents land tax, the impacted lessee is exempted from the operation of the provision. Okay, so they don't have to pay that stuff. So all of this stuff is exactly as it was in the other legislation. So make sure you know that stuff. If they're not paying land tax, make sure you're not paying their land tax for them, because all they're going to be doing is pocketing it because they're not paying it if it's been waived. There's an obligation to renegotiate rent and the other terms of commercial leases before taking any action. They can't, kick you out or anything unless you've tried to come to terms. If you're a party to a commercial lease, and any party to the lease may request the other parties to renegotiate the rent payable under and the other terms of the lease. Okay, so you can go to the landlord and say, I can't pay, we need to make changes here. Okay, you're perfectly entitled to do that. So the parties are renegotiate rents and other terms having regard to the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the leasing principles set out in the National Code of Conduct. So again, that was quite clear. In particular, leasing principle number 3 requires landlords to offer rent reductions in the form of waivers or deferrals of rent proportionate to the lessee's reduction in turnover. Again, this is not adding to it. It's just emphasizing that New South Wales have basically taken on the code as it was prescribed, apart from the end date. The end date's a little bit more prescribed in the New South Wales version. Nothing in this regulation prevents a lessor taking a prescribed action on grounds not related to the economic impacts of COVID. As I said, if they damage the premises, the landlord can still have a go at you for that. You can't just go do anything you want, okay? So there are definitely rules about that. And I think that's it. So that's all I wanted to cover. So I really just wanted to let you know that there are provisions available. I think there was one thing in here, though, about the example. Here's an example of the proportionality. I just wanted to cover this because I know some people were confused. What happens is, in this situation here, what they're saying is that the person suffered a 60% loss in turnover. That results in a guaranteed, note the word guaranteed, 60% cash flow relief. So that what that means is 40% of the money would be paid to the landlord now under their normal rent. So 40% would go to the landlord, 60% left. At least half of that 60% has to be waived. Waived as in never paid again. The other half has to be deferred, okay? And that's at least 50% waived. Some people have waived more and they can choose to waive more. And again, that could be in a situation where the person has got the bank to come to the party and they have waived things from the bank end. So they've passed that on to the business, okay? So if the tenant's revenue fell 100%, then at least 50% of the cash flow relief is rent waiver and 50% of its deferral. If the qualifying tenant's rent had only fallen 30%, then at least 15% of the cash flow relief is rent waiver and the remainder is rent deferral. So again, if you're confused, just look through this example and you'll go, oh yeah, okay, I get what's happening. Care should be taken to ensure that any repayment of the deferred rent does not compromise the ability of the tenant to recover. So the thing is, don't pay back too early. Don't start paying off that deferral when we could end up like Victoria and end up in lockdown again. So be really careful of this, please. Don't get yourself in a situation where you're trying to do the right thing and you actually end up doing the wrong thing. So please be really careful. Is all I wanted to say tonight. Thank you so much guys for showing up. As I said, if you want to get a copy of the slides and documents that I've referred to today, including the retail lease stuff, send me an email and ask me for it, or go onto the page on my website. If you go to my website, under resources, there is Save Money, How to Reduce Business Expenses. And if you go on there and fill in that little form, I will send you out that document, the guide, how to reduce your business expenses. And I will also send you out this information today that we've gone through. Hopefully that's been useful for you. So thank you guys for showing up and good luck. Just make sure that you are looking after yourselves, look after each other. Really watch out for things like your mental health and things at this time. people are getting really stressed. People are getting tetchy and touchy. You just see people reacting to things that they wouldn't normally react to. Be tolerant, be accepting of others. And yeah, that's it. So thanks, guys. I'm going to lock you out now. So catch you later, guys. Bye-bye. Good night. If you want a copy of the slides and the documents I've mentioned today, please let me know. So what you can do, if you go to my website, faqbusinesstraining.com.au, and you'll find in the navigation, Save Money, How to Reduce Business Expenses. If you go to that, I will send you the little guide on how to reduce your business expenses, because if you're needing money coming in from JobKeeper, you probably also should be looking at stopping money going out when you can. So that's like 74 different ways. It's about a 30-page little book. I know Alice has got a copy of it. It's a 30-page little book, just an ebook thing, and it's got about 74 different ways that you can reduce your expenses. So I strongly suggest it would be a helpful, useful thing for you. So if you want to grab that as well as the documents I've talked about today, go there and grab that. Otherwise, you can just send me an email to training@faqbusiness.com.au and I will send you the slides and stuff and the docs from today.